Do you think that that's a more effective strategy as well? That the Europeans should be taking a more overt approach instead of, condemnation is great, economic sanctions are, I guess, but they're one tool in a broader toolbox of which I don't think Europe's using enough, and the Russians wouldn't respond to because they can't.
This is difficult because you easily end up in gradual escalation that gets worse and worse. So I think it's better to focus on the culprits when you have them. What we are seeing, the overflights, I agree with you on that what Turkey did was right. But if Estonia would shoot down a Russian plane, we would probably see a lot of other things happening in Estonia. There are so many ways of acting, so I think it's better to act against the specific people.
This is The Global Gambit.
Okay, interesting. But, I lived in Washington for about 5-6 years. The obsession is China long-term, although there doesn't seem to be an understanding of what that sort of threat from China is. There's a lot of variancy. I think a lot of Washington policymakers just sort of hear China and it's like China is the systemic issue, but they don't really understand what angle of that, how deep they want to take it, what does China actually want. There's just a gross misunderstanding of China, I think, in the US. But there's also a degree of misunderstanding and I think hubris by a lot of US policymakers over the European Union or Europe, and by extension, therefore, relationships to Russia and the sort of broader Eurasia, so to speak. So when you look at the transatlantic relationship, just to bring in this broader sort of geostrategic element, how permanently damaged do you think it is? After what, not just Greenland, I'm going to ignore that for a little bit, but more of the actual reduction in supply of troops, supplies, etc., to critical NATO outposts across Europe, because Trump is doing that incrementally, especially in Poland. So one wonders whether the Europeans have the ability to fill that stopgap, so to speak.
I'm sure that Europe can fill it up, but I think that the damage is permanent. And I would emphasize Greenland. I think that Greenland completely broke European confidence in the US. If you say that you want to take over sovereign territory of NATO partner, NATO doesn't exist in reality. NATO exists as an organization. International organizations normally die very slowly when they are dying, but in order to be effective, there must be credibility. And the credibility of Article 5, one for all, for one, doesn't exist any longer. And it's interesting that the impact was not at all the same when Trump wanted to annex Canada, and Canada as a 50th state. That did not wake up Europe at all in the same way as the Greenland issue. And I think that it won't come back. We can say that Joe Biden was the most pro-European US president ever. And the US will never have a president that is that pro-European again. And we have fundamental structural differences. The whole high-tech industry is American. And it's not only American, but it's based in Silicon Valley, very heavily, or on the West Coast. Also Washington, you can say now, with Musk having moved to Texas a bit there. But it's not at all on the East Coast. The tech sector in the US, you can say that it's 90% of the tech sector in the West, is very alien to Europe in all these regards. And I would expect that the tech sector will be dominant for US politics, particularly for foreign policy, for a long time. While previously we looked to Exxon and Chevron as major forces in foreign policy, making the Middle East very important. Now it is we don't want to be regulated by the European Union, and we are fighting against China. It's a completely different game plan that has popped up within a few years. And if you take the tech billionaires a few years ago, many of them were Democrats. So, the Democrats are rare, and all of a sudden they have become Trump supporters, and they put far more money than anybody else into U.S. Politics right now, with Musk promising $100 million for the Republican candidates now in the midterm election. And their fortunes are so enormous that I think this is what we should see as the mainstay of US foreign policy. And there's nothing European in it.
So that reminds me of the adage, America innovates, China imitates or replicates, and the Europeans regulate. Do you think that that is part of it? Does Europe have a bit of an over-regulation issue? I personally think it's important to ensure there is a limit to private enterprise. Otherwise, I don't think big corporations, big tech necessarily has the best interests for the average public. But people say, oh, he's a socialist by saying that. No, not really. So how do you think Europe balances this need to stimulate the economies? Because even Germany's facing a little bit of a concern. This I think is 800 million that they've granted towards military expenditure now to revitalize, maybe remilitarize parts of the industrial base in that sectors. But that means Germany's export-led economy is going to be fundamentally changed. So how do you think Europe plays this most effectively?
Very poorly. I mean, it's a regulate rather than innovate. Imitation might be okay, but it's far too slow. I mean, Europe is very much seen from US as a historical theme park. A very nice one, and all these good numbers on long life expectancy and low infant mortality, etc. All the social indicators that are far better in Europe and in the US, including in the new East European countries, they make no impact whatsoever here in. It's not noticed, and you can see it. People like Paul Krugman and similar people pick it up. Americans don't seem to care, and any European can see the many health problems in the US and how poorly they are being managed, but it has no impact on the American voters.
Now, the other thing that you also mentioned is about NATO, and again, weaving in the sort of the European Union / NATO elements here, because I always, even I get confused about just how interoperable these two are. Macron has also raised the idea of a European army. Like, if NATO is so intrinsically linked with the United States, is it better off not just the European Union developing its own form of security arm?
I think so, but most experts who know these things much better than I do don't think so. The European Commission has now, for the first time, a defense commissioner. Former Lithuanian Prime Minister Andrius Kubilius, who's a very skillful person, but his job is then primarily to look upon defense industry, the economic part of the defense, rather than strategic capabilities. All these things still lie within In NATO, you can also see that the military support for Ukraine is with NATO in a special facility in Wiesbaden, which now has several hundred employees. We have of old the Western European Union, which has not developed as a military organization. So things exist on paper. We also have one paragraph on the Treaty of the European Union, on mutual defense, which is actually stronger than NATO's Article 5, but it's not taken seriously. So that it's not seen as an actual mutual defense pact, although it exists on paper.
So this also makes me think again about another element to the US security provision, Anders, which is that, from my understanding, and maybe you'll correct me or something, but the biggest Achilles heel that Europe has is the surveillance angle, the logistical angle here, that the United States has the military capacity to, well, it just has a much bigger military. Let's just keep it simple, right? And even if the Europeans want to take over, say, security assurances in the form of the nuclear umbrella, you don't need lots of nukes to be an effective deterrent there. The collective deterrence of Europe is there, but the collective, how to say, like, supply capacity isn't. There's concerns over there was this exercise done in Romania, I think about 6-7 months ago, led by France. And all it demonstrated was that NATO without the United States was not able to continue to supply the front lines, the forward lines as well. And so when people look at the Baltics as a place where Russia may potentially launch some kind of operation, incursion, it's not clear exactly what they would do. The Eastern Sentinel, or the forward deterrence that NATO has there, led by, I think, the Brits in the Baltics, or one of them is led by the Brits and the Poles, even if they were able to fend off the first wave of attacks, they wouldn't be able to sustain that for very long. So do you have any insights on that, and where the Europeans need to fill that shortage most acutely?
This is a very important comment you just made, Pyotr. The European armies are in their nature national. Do you need much transportation if you are within your own country? Not really. So what Europe is missing, it's transportation planes, big military transportation planes, which the US has plenty of, all together refueling the tankers, the big refueling airplanes. So Europe is not prepared for a long-distance war. It's only prepared for national defense in what they have. And lasting investments. So this is something that you cannot fix in a few years. It will take many years to get it done.
But how long? Is 10 years enough? The idea that the British, for example, the British government have put 2035 as the baseline by which 3.5% will be spent on defence. Some people say that we need to spend 5%. But that requires significant reallocation of resources, cutting benefits, discontinuing development aid. I mean, the British government are also doing this. They're dropping it from 0.3% to 0.1%, I think, of GDP is now being spent on ODA, or overseas development assistance. So how does Europe come up with the money for all of this?
To start with the money, here you have a radically different situation in the north and in the south. The south, Spain, Italy, Greece, France, have also Britain actually, have very strained budgets, and they have large public debts. If you take countries like Denmark and Sweden, they have public debt of 35% rather than 100%, which is typical in the south. And therefore, the Nordic and Baltic countries can rearm fast, and they do it. While France is a typical example not doing much. Spain and Italy are even worse, while Greece traditionally spends a lot on its defense because of its, what should I call it, its relationship with Turkey, which is something completely different. So, and these Europeans, are apart from Hungary, are by and large in good financial situation. Fiscal conservatives, they are ready for the new situation, while the South is not. And therefore it's quite natural that it takes a longer time for them to act, and also that they feel that they are not as threatened as the North and the East feel that they are.
Well, this is the thing. There was a piece in the Financial Times, I think it was an op-ed, about 4 or 5 months ago. And it was quite remarkable in that it was recognizing the fact that when Maloney won, the concerns over the AFD or PiS party in Poland, the point is that a lot of what we would perceive as nationalistic or with populistic tendencies in parties have actually increasingly been some of the biggest advocates of defending European sovereignty, because it falls into that basket of their narrative agenda. So Trump's overreach in his threats towards Greenland and so on is actually bringing a united sort of understanding that Europe needs to be more strategically autonomous. Do you think that that's sustainable? Like, were Marine Le Pen, for example, to win next year, or her subordinate to win, do you think that would actually be as big a threat, because the threats, the bigger exogenous threats that come from Moscow or whatever, outweigh their self-interests of increasing national sovereignty? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, this is a big issue. I'm actually following relatively closely how the right-wing parties act in the European Parliament. And, are now really in 3 different groups. AfD, Alternative for Germany, is the hardcore pro-Russian and pro-Nazi, if I may say so, party that even Le Pen kicked AfD out of their group because they were too tolerant of former Nazis. So then the next group, it's Marine Le Pen and the National Assembly, they are called now in France, Geert Wilders in Holland, and Salvini, the League in Italy. Previously, Orban was in that group also. Fico in Slovakia and Andrej Babiš in the Czech Republic, and they are tolerant of Russia, and they are not pro-Ukrainian at all. Vox is also in Spain, is also in that group. And then we have the others, that is Giorgia Meloni and PiS, as you mentioned, and also the Sweden Democrats and the Finns, generally the Nordic and Baltic hard right, they are pro-Ukrainian. So the hard right in the European Parliament is strictly divided between those who are pro-Ukrainian and those who are pro-Russian. it's typical that apart from Orban, Fico and Babiš, the Prime Minister of
Public.
Hungary, Slovakia and the Czech Republic, the Western hard right, they have not been in government. And we saw Giorgia Meloni being very pro-Western, becoming very pro-Western when she became prime minister, which was not a given at all before. It's if the National Assembly will win in the presidential elections in France next year, if Marine Le Pen will become a president, I don't know where she would come out. That it's possible that she would moderate. Her deputy Bardella is clearly moving in a more moderate direction, and it has been quite interesting to see hard right parties in all the 4 Nordic countries moved in very sensible directions. You can say that the Sweden Democrats, apart from immigration, they are basically a mainstream conservative party now. The Progress Party in Norway is basically an anti-tax. The Finns, they were against the bailout of Greece. That was their big issue, and then they have caught up on anti-immigration. So anti-immigration tends to be the big issue for the hard right, and then they are very confused on Russia and Ukraine and can come down on either side. So, for example, the Sweden Democrats, they got split in 2014 because there were 2 factions, those who were in favor of Putin and those who were in favor of Charles XII. The Charles XII faction won, and tough as they are, they kicked out the Putin people altogether. It's quite interesting to follow, but it's not obvious where the various parties will go.
Yeah, and I think this leads me to the Russian angle momentarily, which is that this is one of the biggest pressure points Putin often likes to utilize, try to leverage. Certainly, do you think that this could only grow? We're seeing more of these incursions. We had obviously in Leipzig this attempted sabotage a couple of weeks ago, which was thwarted. But how concerned are you by the Kremlin's capacity to interfere more in clandestine ways across Europe?
Very much so. Given all the Western sanctions, Russia has very little reason to be nice to Europe. Europe is getting tougher and tougher. So this is moving in one direction only. The question is how fast and by what means. There are so many things that are happening. So that Poland publicized that there have been 69 cases of Russian suspect sabotage in Poland in the last 2 years, 2024 and 2025. So this is on a massive scale. The worst was when they were blowing away railways, which could have caused a major railway accident in Poland. It didn't happen because of a smart engineer who saw that something was wrong, but it could have caused a lot of life. In Norway and Sweden, all energy assets have been surveyed by drones, by unknown from home. And in either country, this is considered a crime, which it should be. Also in Denmark, the airports have been surveyed by drones. We have seen similar things in Germany. Many years ago, the Daily Beast published 15 suspect murders in Britain from 2008 on that were probably carried out by Russians. And the authorities didn't deal anything with it. We have cases like Boris Berezovsky, the famous oligarch who happened to hang himself, allegedly. And then the 3 of his closest collaborators in Britain happened to die in where they finally said, the British police finally said that it was murder. But there have been a couple of cases here in Washington. 15, Mikhail Lesin, former Minister of Information, happened to kill himself with a baseball bat in a hotel room the day before he was going to the Department of Justice to testify against Putin. And clearly the authorities covered it up because it was too embarrassing that they had been so incompetent. So I think that this is on a massive scale, and the Estonians are very good at this. I was in Estonia a year ago and talked with various intelligence people, and they say the first thing you have to do is to make sure that all the Russian sabotage acts are illegal, which is not the case, as I said, in Sweden and Norway, for example. The second is that you have to prosecute people and give them a long prison sentences. In Estonia, it's about 20 people that have given long prison sentences for Russian-inspired, and then publicize it. So what we are seeing is that for bad reasons, Western countries, when they find it, most of the time they don't publicize it. A simple explanation is that intelligence agencies don't want to publicize anything if they can avoid, nor do they want to prosecute if they can avoid. So this is a general European policy that needs to be changed. So the Estonians have moved first here. The Poles have done a lot, while most of the other countries have done extremely little.
Yeah, so on that point, I think I'll be more blunt then, Anders. There is a simple approach that a lot of people argue, which is simply, yes, you call them out on it, you identify, and you publicly shame them. But more specifically, you use kinetic action. So what I'm being specific about, and people who watch regularly will know the example I'm about to use, which is that when the Russians flew a jet over Turkey in 2015, whenever it was shot down, right? The Turks just shut it down. And the Russians did a very British thing, which is that they wrote a sternly worded letter in condemning the act. But that's all they did. So the point is, respond through, right? It's not like Russia can claim that the Estonians are acting out of negligence or aggression, because they're simply defending their sovereign airspace. If the Russians are launching, we've seen plenty of flyovers in the past several months. The British with the Yantar and surveillance ships, those lasers that were fired at British soldiers, RAF personnel about 4 or 5 months ago. Do you think that that's a more effective strategy as well? That the Europeans should be taking a more overt approach instead of, condemnation is great, economic sanctions are, I guess, but they're one tool in a broader toolbox of which I don't think Europe's using enough, and the Russians wouldn't respond to because they can't.
Yeah. This is difficult because you easily end up in a gradual escalation that gets worse and worse. So I think it's better to focus on the culprits when you have them. What we are seeing, the overflights, I agree with you on that what Turkey did was right. But if Estonia would shoot down a Russian plane, we would probably see a lot of other things happening in Estonia. I mean, what happened in Lithuania, that warehouses are being burnt down. These things, there are so many ways of acting. So I think it's better to act against the specific people and put them into prison than take direct war actions. When the Russians start shooting down airplanes, yes, then of course, but perhaps not with overflight. This needs a lot of consideration. What is the right action? But first, one should do the elementary things. Actually, what is really illegal, and make sure that people can get 20 years in prison for Russian inspired sabotage.
Certainly, one wants to adhere to international law. That's what Trump seems to have forgotten. I mean, he seems to love North Korea's Kim Jong-un. Right now, he's the in thing. But my only concern with that is it's slow moving, and does it do enough to be a deterrent for Putin's broader strategic ambitions and interests? So I guess my last question really, Anders, and I'd love to have you back soon to discuss the deeper angle of Russia, because we've mainly focused on Europe in this conversation. But simply, you've spoken to intelligence people, you speak to a lot of policymakers. What would be the one thing you think Europe should prioritize, and how should they go about doing it?
I mean, priority now is maximum support for Ukraine, so that Ukraine can win the war. I think that war is heating up now, so that within 1 year something will fundamentally change. People both in Russia and Ukraine are now very tired. So do whatever we can for Ukraine in the short term.
Okay, well, on that front, everyone, just like the Ukrainians on their battlefront, thank you very much for watching and supporting. And of course, Anders, very much for your incredible insights. You seem to know everything possible. I've flung all sorts of questions at you, and you've done an incredibly intricate job and in-depth job of answering them. So I look forward to having you back, hopefully very soon, for a deep dive on Russia's economy and the future there, because there's a lot I've got thoughts as well. But everyone for watching, of course, check out Anders' work, and I'll see you all very soon. Stay safe out there. Take care.
Thank you very much.